New World Order. Will this tragic period of geopolitical tension mark the beginning of a new world order? Could the Russian invasion become a watershed moment in modern history that could see the collapse of the US empire and the rise of a new illiberal world order spearheaded by China and Russia? Tune in tonight as I attempt to make sense of the changing political order. Now, before I begin, I want to give some background to this discussion. I've spent pretty much the best part of the last 2 days attempting to make sense of the situation in Ukraine and Russia. I know many people have been trying to establish a sense of understanding about what has led to the situation in Russia and Ukraine. What is the background? What's the rationale for the invasion? What's going to come from this? How will it end? It certainly captured our attention, and I really come at this whole conversation with two primary intentions. One is to be pro-peace, full stop. I wish to live in a world without conflict. And the second is to really seek to understand the complexities of the situation. But I also recognize I do so from a privileged standpoint, from the comfort of my own home here in the United Kingdom. But want nonetheless to understand the situation in order to best make sense of how we can navigate this world in order to move towards a world that is free from conflict. So I recognize the complexities of this situation. Anyone that kind of reduces this down to a simple story like we've seen in the mainstream media, my overall sense is they are missing the point. And in preparation for this particular discussion around the changing world order, I've read somewhere between 60 to 100 articles. I've watched a number of long form videos. I've had a number of group conversations with people from America, Russia, China, Europe, United Kingdom. I've spoken to people who have lived through the Cold War. I've really tried to immerse myself in the situation in order to get a deeper understanding. And there's a whole range of issues that I could talk about as I enter into this particular subject. But I've chosen to center on the changing world order because when there is a global conflict like this, there are always winners and losers. And it's not just the nations involved in the conflict who stand to win or lose. There are many, many variables. And what I'm trying to do over this conversation and perhaps others is to unpack who some of those winners and losers may be. Now, what is clear from the outset is that the civilians in both countries, Russia and Ukraine, are the ultimate losers here. The pain and suffering that has been inflicted upon those living in Ukraine, those under attack, those who have lost loved ones under this tragic situation are the ultimate losers. That said, with the economic sanctions being placed upon Russia, Russian civilians too will be feeling the effects of those sanctions, and it's inevitable that Russian citizens will also be going through an enormous period of suffering. And if they aren't yet, then certainly the economic ramifications will be harsh. And of course, we're witnessing people from across the globe who are Russian citizens being abused because of the situation in Ukraine. So I try to mention both because I think it's important to recognize how the civilians, the citizens of both nations will be suffering, but also to recognize on the global stage, having just come from one global atrocity to the next, clearly citizens around the world watching this are affected in very different ways. So before we address who some of the winners may be, I think it is important to take a moment to recognize those who will lose from this. The civilians on both sides of the battle, conflict, and those who witness wishing for peace. I know many people are suffering in fear for what this could escalate to. So I think it's important to underscore that point, that there are always losers in conflict like this, and some of them profound and devastating. Now, the world is a hostile environment where, in the absence of diplomacy, whereby diplomacy seeks to at least endeavor to achieve a win-win outcome, in the absence of such diplomacy, hostile environments like this are often, or at least very often, a zero-sum game, meaning that a win for one is often a loss for another. But it's, as I mentioned, not as simple as two individual countries or nations. There are many variables at stake here, and who will be the winners and losers and what it means for the world order is the subject of tonight's discussion. Now, I've put a great deal, as I mentioned, of effort in terms of background understanding of the situation. I appreciate this is a different take on the situation, looking at the shifting world order, the particular impact upon the United States, the Western or North Atlantic Treaty, the Eastern involvement, particularly with China. But I do so with a somewhat reasonable background understanding of economics. It was my degree at university some 20 years ago, but nonetheless, I have a reasonable grasp of economic and geopolitical principles. And it's my goal with this conversation, as best to my ability, to break down some of the complexities of this geopolitical situation into a way that each of us can understand, in order that we can navigate the changing power dynamics and understand what it means for ourselves and what it means for those of us who seek to live in a world that is peaceful. So let me begin by articulating what I mean by world order. Now, the title of tonight's episode, New World Order, was somewhat ominous. I recognize this. In the context of the last 2 years, where we have been through a global pandemic, whereby the corporate interests of the pharmaceutical industrial complex have been overt, with many of the kind of authoritarian rises in leadership across the world, it's evident that some may have thought that tonight's episode would have been about the changing world order as it pertains to the type of technocracy that we've seen in the last couple of years and this rise in authoritarianism. And I will touch upon that because it does indeed play a role. But that is a subject that I will cover in more depth following this episode. Tonight, when I speak of world order, I'm really speaking about order as a system for governance between people. This particular part of the conversation at the front end, at least economically speaking, is inspired by a really, really powerful video by Ray Dalio entitled Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. It's approximately 40 to 45 minutes. It's an animated video which breaks down the kind of economic and political cycles of the last 500 years and really gives you some clues about what history can teach us about what's happening in the world today. Because frankly, human beings really don't learn from their mistakes and they really don't learn from their history. Therefore, things like we're witnessing today may take a slightly different form, but ultimately are a reflection of past realities that we've lived through but not learned from. And Ray's video does a cracking job of bringing together in a very simple way some of those historic trends, and it illustrates where we are today and what we can predict that the future may look like. Because the benefit of understanding history, even in the face of the unknown, or is seemingly unknown, is that patterns of human behavior recur over and over and over again. Those of you that have read any amount of philosophy will know that despite the shifts in technology and the advances in the economic progress, really the human condition has altered very little. Yes, we've evolved as a species, but when we talk about evolution, we often talk about technological evolution and its relationship with human beings. But history shows us a great deal about where we are today. And in the context of this conversation, I refer to a world order as a system for governing between people. In fact, there's two distinctions. An internal order is the order within the governing state within a nation, and a world order is the governance between countries, which is often set out in international treaties. Again, world orders tend to change after wars, whether they are civil wars or international wars. They can happen in other means, sometimes peaceful, but they tend to happen when growing economic forces or growing political forces begin to defeat the older, withering forces, those that are on the decline. And these big cycles, as Ray Dalio calls them, normally last up to 200 years, are often accompanied with a period of 10 to 20 years in transition. And the way these big cycles work is they go from peace, prosperity, and productivity on the upside, using debt in a productive manner in order to grow the economy. But this upward trend in economic growth tends to exacerbate the inequalities within society. It widens the wealth gaps. Over time, people behave as though this economic prosperity is going to last forever, which leads to governments, businesses, and individuals overstretching themselves, which then triggers an economic downturn. As a result, governments tend to start printing money, often slowly, but then more rapidly, which leads to sometimes depression, economic depression, which can lead to revolution or war on the downward cycle. And that can, again, take the form of conflict, or it can take the form of civil unrest, before eventually debt and political restructuring occurs ahead of the transition into a new world order. So these big cycles can be witnessed within this video that I've shared with you. I'll put the link in the comments, over the last 500 years. And they offer the context for this particular conversation. Now, the economic decline often begins gradually, as I mentioned, and then rather suddenly. Countries get deeper into debt when they begin to borrow. They often borrow, surprisingly, from poorer countries who have high levels of savings. And then when the country's or the nation's economy begins to further decline, the governments then print more money in order to avoid defaulting on the debts that they've incurred with other nations. Now, over time, in simple terms, again, without getting too technical on the economics of this, essentially what happens is the currency devalues. This weakens the nation's currency, typically raises inflation. Governments usually respond by increasing the taxes on the wealthiest individuals and on business in order to try and recoup some of the deficit, which often will then see an outflow of funds as those who are experiencing the higher taxation move their funds and even their physical location, whether corporations or individuals, to other nations where the conditions or the tax conditions are more favorable. And this marks typically the end of an economic cycle, and will create internal conflict within the nation. It raises the risk of international conflict. And as such, the governments typically increase their military spend in order to defend their position. And it ultimately leads to a position where the incumbent empire will likely be challenged in a test of power. Now, I share this as background understanding, background context to the broader conversation that we'll have today about the situation in Russia and Ukraine, really to expand the conversation, to zoom out on the macro picture about how this conflict in Ukraine and Russia will affect the global economic and political situation. Because the countries of the world and their interactions in some way can be compared to the movement of tectonic plates. The plates within the Earth, the plates move slowly and steadily over time, but eventually, as those tectonic plates move, tension begins to build up, and eventually that tension in the Earth needs to be released, creates earthquakes, volcanoes, landmass erupting or emerging from the ocean, or even submerging into it, of plains becoming mountains, and so on. And the countries in their interactions over time also create tension in the way that these tectonic shifts occur, until eventually they erupt in usually a form of war. And as I mentioned, humans are supposed to be the most evolved creatures, but we've seemingly not learned the lessons of past conflict and the devastation that it causes, the great losses, both in terms of life, but also in terms of the state of the nation that is affected and those that are involved. But as I mentioned, after the wars, there's generally treaties, agreements, which mark the beginning of a new world order, and usually, unfortunately, a period of relative peace and stability. Now, I say this because the tension between Russia and the Western countries has been mounting for years. And it's important to recognize that, and I will inevitably record a conversation on the role of NATO and the West in the situation in Ukraine, because it's very easy for the Western media to reduce this down to a notion that, you know, Putin is evil and play the old superhero story of good versus evil. That may play a role, but it's ultimately more complex than that. And we have to recognize the tensions, the pre-existing tensions. And I could speak at depth of that from the background reading. But I just really want to set that as a context for today, because that tension between Russia and other parts of the Western world has been mounting for years. We've seen small eruptions in Syria, and now in Crimea, and now a much larger one in Ukraine. Now, tonight's conversation is about the changing world order, and one critical component of that world order is that the dominant nations typically, as they decline, the value of their currency begins to decline with them, as I've mentioned. And as a result, people lose faith in that currency. They begin to sell that currency, and that marks the end of the big cycle as the currency devalues. This, at this point, is usually the trigger point for the beginning of a new world order. And the question tonight really is whether the conflict in Ukraine will mark the beginning of a new world order. Is the United States, the American reign as the leading power, under threat? The fact that their dollar is devaluing and diminishing, is this an indicator that the world powers could be shifting? We've lived in a world for decades now where the US has had free reign almost to ignore international law, the World Court, the United Nations Charter, because really it's had the military might that no nation could rationally contest without upscaling into a serious or devastating warlike conflict. Yeah, as I mentioned, the US dollar is beginning to slide. The US has massive debts. It spends more than it earns, and it funds this with more borrowing and printing of money. So it's really in that economic decline stage that I outlined at the beginning of this episode. So we've got this shifting power dynamic where we've got Russia trying to exert its dominance in Europe. We've got the involvement now of China with Russia, which we'll speak about extensively tonight. And we've got the shifting relationship between NATO and the West, and we've also got the decline of the US. And now we're seeing Russia with its military over the last 30 years gaining strength since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Now some say is restored to the point where, if not as imposing or far-reaching as other nations like the US, it clearly now has great power in Europe, although some critics would say that its power has not been wielded effectively over time. But it does show very clearly that Russia is willing to do what it takes and what it wants within its own neighborhood and within its borders, irrespective of international law. So whilst Russia in its military might could indeed pose a real threat, certainly to its neighbors, as witnessed, but more broadly to the West, does it really have the economic and political might to threaten the overall world order? Is there, therefore, if Russia does not hold these cards to a shift in the world order, is there, therefore, a bigger tectonic shift at play here? So, as the world is watching this scenario, this situation, this conflict, this war in Ukraine and Russia, there is a growing alliance between Beijing, China, and Moscow, Russia. And therefore, has this conflict made China more important as a leading world power? This is the guiding question for the next part of our discussion, because the outrage of over Russia's invasion of Ukraine should not obscure one important fact, that China, with about a 10 times larger population and economy than Russia, poses the greatest challenge to America. Russia really is not a huge threat to America in terms of the world order or its dominance, whereas China is a significant threat to America. Russia's strategic priorities and ambitions are really concentrated at this point within its own neighborhood, whereas China is working to supplant the US as the dominant global power, irrespective of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. So what's interesting to observe now as we take a wider lens is that Putin, through his war of aggression, is unwittingly helping Beijing, China, by distracting the US from its China challenge. Now, the war has the makings of a long, drawn-out and dangerous confrontation between Russia, Ukraine, NATO. However, all of this will help China's dream of becoming the global dominant power. And this is the primary issue that I seek to center upon as we take this wider lens view of the conflict and recognizing how the interplay of global conflict between Russia and Ukraine, its wider ramifications on the global order, as I explore tonight the shifts in power between the East and the West. Now, let's take a little bit of a history lesson. 50 years after Richard Nixon, the former American president, and Mao Zedong's historic 1972 handshake, which signified a significant shift in the global order, the geopolitical order is once again reshaping. Now, 40 years on from that moment between America and China, since assuming power in October 2012, Xi Jinping in China has given the clearer and clearer indications that China is not only seeking to enjoy a central position on the global stage, commensurate with its economic and military power, but also to reshape, alter, and redefine elements of the existing world order to better align with its own views and interests. And some would argue, and I will make the case later on, that what we've witnessed over the last couple of years are a reflection of that, as we've seen this rise of the authoritarianism. Interestingly, it's corresponded with a huge rise in overseas investment from China, the increase in Chinese propaganda throughout the pandemic, obviously the origin of the pandemic itself. Some would speculate that it was a deliberate lab leak, and interesting how the economics have shifted over that 2-year period. More billionaires have been created in China than any other time in history over the last 2 years. So China's economy has really grown from strength to strength over the last 2 years. And its impact of COVID-19, despite it being originated or supposedly originated from China, its impact has been relatively minimal compared to the global stage. And even now, in the midst of some of the recent stories come China on the impact of COVID there and the lockdowns, it's hard to discern between what is real and what is propaganda. But it's like other countries, it's clear that COVID is still with us. But that's not the conversation for tonight, but it's more a signpost to the influence of China, the increasing influence of China in the Western world. If you look at the major central institutions, whether it's the United Nations, World Economic Forum, China has made its way into these institutions at an increasing scale over the last 4 to 5 years, certainly since Xi Jinping has been in power. Not only has he shown his desire to redefine elements of the current world order, he's shown an increasing appetite to take major risks, believing that China has a narrow window of opportunity, strategic opportunity to modify the international order in its favor before it confronts a demographic crisis within its own nation, a stalled economic growth that may have stemmed from the rear end of the pandemic, and an increasingly, that I'm speaking globally now, but and an unfavorable global environment. Now, to give further background and context on this, in October 2016, the Chinese currency, the yen, entered a new phase in its journey to become more important to the world economy, and it officially became a member of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund's a basket of global reserve currencies. Now, together, this group of reserve currencies held by the IMF, known as special drawing rights, or SDR for short, is only used by the IMF to supplement countries' official reserves. Now, the value of this currency pot is determined by the set of the currencies in the basket, which is mainly the US dollar, the euro, the UK pound, and now the yen, and each of which is given a weighting towards a final calculation of value. It's essentially a very exclusive club as far as currencies go. So inclusion within this mix is incredibly symbolic for China, which has been trying for years to promote the yuan globally, in part to move the world away from the reliance upon the dollar as the prevailing reserve currency. Now, at the time, it was thought that the change would not lead to a major rise in demand for the yen, because the total value of the overall pot used as reserves paled into comparison of that of the dollar, the dollar reserve. However, its inclusion certainly endorsed the yen as a top-ranked international currency on par with the US dollar, confirming China's status on the world stage as an economic and financial superpower, which becomes really fascinating right now because China currently accounts for a larger proportion of world trade than the US. There is certainly, as I mentioned, a huge expansion overseas, both in terms of trade and overseas investment. And most people have become keenly aware that the response from China to the situation in Ukraine is very distinct from that of the US and the NATO alliance. So and to be clear, China has taken a relatively neutral stance initially. China has not condemned the invasion of Ukraine publicly, and indeed it has formed an alliance in many ways to stand beside Russia within this situation, although it remains firm in its stance that it believes in the diplomatic world in terms of international relations, which I'll expand upon in a minute. But let's look at the last couple of months to explore why the Chinese response may be different to that of the US. Now, during a call between Xi Jinping of China and Putin last December 2021, the Chinese leader supported Russia's demand that Ukraine must not join NATO. And again, the NATO conversation is a much bigger piece of the puzzle that we need to unravel and extract as part of this sense-making around what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. But the important part for this conversation is that China essentially supported Russia's demand that Ukraine must not join NATO. Now, the Chinese Communist Party leader and the Russian President Putin subsequently met then in early February 2022 on the opening day of the Beijing Winter Olympics, whereby many external commentators would have believed that that would have granted the opportunity for Xi Jinping to urge Putin to pursue diplomacy with Ukraine and to de-escalate tensions between the two countries ahead of the outbreak of war. But instead, the Chinese regime appeared to have looked the other way as Russia planned its advances upon its neighbor. So instead, now many have described the meeting on the 4th of February as a show of solidarity between the two regimes. The occasion was marked by a lengthy joint statement in which the two leaders announced their respective nations had entered into a no-limits partnership meant as a counterweight to the alliances between the US and other democracies within NATO. The statement expressed opposition to the further enlargement of NATO and called upon the North Atlantic Alliance to abandon its ideologicalized Cold War approaches, to respect sovereignty, security, and interests of other countries, and to exercise a fair and objective attitude towards the peaceful development of other states. Now, in retrospect, this may seem sizably hypocritical, given that Russia and its subsequent attack on the sovereignty, security, and interests of Ukraine. But many of us have now recognized just how much Ukraine is really a pawn in a much bigger game. And in the face of sanctions imposed upon Russia by the West following the Russian invasion, the Chinese economic and political support of Russia would signal a geopolitical shift that could upend American foreign policy and be felt from Europe to Asia. But it does seem that China is walking a very fine line. Now, last week, following a 2-hour call on the 18th of March, Joe Biden, the American president, detailed implications and consequences to China should Chinese President Xi Jinping provide material support to Russia as Putin's forces continue an assault against Ukraine, at least according to a White House description of the call between the two men. Now, the White House official declined to specify the penalties that the US could impose if China provided Russia with any material support, nor would the official from the White House say how China responded to the requests. Now, the official that was covering the story from the US conversation with China said the president really wasn't making any specific requests of China. He was merely laying out his assessment of the situation and the implications of certain actions. Sounds like quite a hypothetical, non-threatening conversation, we'll say. And it seems that therefore America is also treading carefully and walking a fine line, as indeed China is. At least with regards to the relationship between America and China. Not so, however, with the relationship with Russia, where the approaches are distinctly different. But the Chinese officials have sent mixed signals about the crisis in recent days. The Chinese foreign minister mentioned Ukraine by name last week, and that might sound bizarre to say, but Chinese propaganda, Chinese media around this issue has been very different to what we'd see in the West. And as part of my research for this conversation, I had the opportunity to talk to some former Chinese residents who have family in China. They shared the different nature of the reporting in China. So to mention Ukraine by name and even to show some of the footage from the damage that's been caused, the devastation that's been caused by the Russian invasion, is a shift in the Chinese approach. Nonetheless, the foreign minister affirmed that the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected and safeguarded from assault. So in many ways, they are treading that balance in forming an alliance in some ways with Russia, yet seemingly not trying to upset the Western order. I'll unpack that a little bit more in a minute. However, the foreign minister, Wang Yi, said that if anyone questions China's attitude on this matter, it's an ill-intended, sensationalized and distortion of Chinese positions. So they remain resolute on their own position. But the reality is what China decides to do about Russia's needs could mark a real turning point, both in the war in Ukraine and within the US-China relationship. And the outcome of China's choice will define potentially what a global new order looks like. So will China continue to attempt to reshape the global economy in its own image by participating in it? Or will China join Russia behind a new iron curtain of sanctions, cut off from the US and Europe, and left to navigate a new monetary system and trading framework of its own? This is a possible reality, but I think it's an increasingly unlikely reality that China will join of Russia and form their own allegiance as a new bloc with a new monetary system, but it is possible. Nonetheless, I will speak as we enter the latter stages of this episode about what a changing world order could look like in this regard. Now, broadly, China has calculated that the US is in decline, as we opened up with today, and that Western democracies have failed over the course of the pandemic, and that Russia is one ally at least that they can work alongside in order to create a different international system. However, if China wants Russia to be its partner in building a new global order, but it also wants to be viewed as a responsible power that can someday lead the global order, or at least be at the center of a new system of global governance and connectivity and economic prosperity, then the support of Russia's violent effort to take Ukraine comes at very considerable risk for China, because it risks severing many of its existing economic relationships with the West. China relies very heavily on its trading patterns and relationships with European countries, and it's worked very hard to prevent Europe from restricting trade. So if China ends up with a vast amount of countries around the world that are aligned against it because it sided with Russia, then it could be a devastating blow to China and its potential ascendancy to the New World Order. Now, if China, however, provides Russia with drones, missiles, or other weapons, it could very clearly demonstrate that there is a break, therefore, in that expected world order. And it would be clear that China had a very firmly sided with Russia against the democratic world and against the developed democracies in the West. Now, similarly, if Russia emerges from the war in Ukraine and China backed it, China could then suffer a major economic backlash. And there is already some evidence within China that they are hedging against this, against fluctuations in the Russian ruble. However, Chinese media, as I mentioned, have started to move slightly away from their neutral stance and begun to cover the Russian role in the devastation in Ukraine, highlighting the damages recently caused upon the Ukrainian care home and the impact on the elderly there. This is an indication that China is perhaps now straying away from the perception that it is supporting Russia, at least in terms of what Biden and the Americans call material support, in terms of weaponry and such. However, a national security reporter for the Wall Street Journal recently told CNN that the Chinese want to work with the United States. They want to have a trade relationship. Again, China working the lines, playing both sides. For them to have Putin coming out with his hands extended, asking for help, puts them in a very strong position, but seemingly retaining a relationship with Europe and America is of equal importance. So in simple terms, it seems that China is likely to continue to pretend, demonstrate that they're willing to cooperate with the US while quietly undermining Western sanctions, including helping Russia to find China-centered financial workarounds, whilst it quietly maneuvers to economic and political dominance. What does this mean for China? What do they stand to gain? This entire conversation is about who are the winners and losers. Well, it seems that President Biden is unlikely to have factored in what I call the boomerang effect following the US sanctions upon Russia. the unintended consequences of which could split the global economy, polarize international politics, and strengthen China at America's expense. A growing body of evidence suggests that America's past use of economic sanctions have proved often counterproductive to America's own economic and geopolitical interests. And in this case, in particular, it could accelerate a shift in the world order that may no longer be dominated by the American West. And it's becoming increasingly clear that the US approach, which is centered upon these unparalleled sanctions, will in fact help China become the big winner financially and geopolitically, thereby actually aiding and abetting its expansion of its own economic and military power. How is this going to happen? Well, the West's heavy economic penalties on Moscow, including unplugging the Russian banks from the international payment system, are essentially set to turn China into Russia's banker, enable it to reap massive profits. In structural terms, Russia's sanctions will also be China's gain. It will help insulate itself from similar Western sanctions if it were to invade Taiwan, for example. And Beijing is seeking to boost the payments and reserve role of the yen and the international use of its very own competitor to the SWIFT network, the European Western payments network, known as the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, or SIPS. So the West's sanctions against Russia are likely to accelerate this monetary system used by China. Now, furthermore, the sanctions have also opened up the path for China to build an energy safety net, not only with the exports of gas and oil from Russia, but through land-based imports, so it can withstand a potential US-led energy embargo or blockade in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan at a later date. And the reimposition of sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline is welcome news also for Beijing, which is seeking to further boost energy imports from Russia, has concluded now a new oil and gas deal worth $117 billion during President Putin's visit to China last month. Now, whether any of this will, or any of these deals will, be sufficient to aid Russia's ailing economy is unknown. However, it is becoming increasingly clear that the West targeting of just Russia is certain to make China the main beneficiary of the sanctions. So the more pain that is inflicted upon Russia through sanctions, the more power is given to China effectively, and the more it aids President Xi Jinping's China dream of supplanting the US as the world's preeminent power. Now, what does this mean for the United States? If you're watching from the US or you're a citizen of the US, you're probably wondering what on earth is going on and what does this mean for you? Unfortunately, it's not particularly good news. Now, a potential US dollar collapse may indeed be another consequence of going so hard on Russia. Russia and other countries, including India and other major nations, are looking for alternatives to the dollar. Sanctions that have been imposed, coupled with the American Fed's massive inflation of the dollar supply since the economic crisis of 2008, namely the 25 million in printing of money and the 9 trillion for the COVID response, has really shaken confidence in the US government and the dollar as a world reserve. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, what does reserve currency mean? Well, I've touched upon it earlier today, but reserve currency means that central banks around the world hold dollars in reserve, as an enormous amount of the global trade is priced and conducted in dollars. It's the general terms of business. Reserve currency status also gives the US a great amount of power and influence over world affairs. However, amid the Russia-Ukraine war, the US sanctions in many ways mean that they've weaponized the dollar against Russia in order to tackle the conflict. Now, as a result, many countries no longer trust the United States. They could, at a later date, become a victim of such sanctions, with America's history of using economic sanctions. and they are beginning to lose faith in the dollar as a stable medium of exchange and store of value. Simply put, the United States has, in many ways, abused the dollar's standing as the world reserve, and now it's under threat. This is amplified by the fact that it was reported last week that Saudi Arabia is now accepting or considering accepting yen instead of dollars for its oil sales to China. This is a significant global market, and just this very act alone, even if a small percentage of trade is now in yen rather than dollars, would dent the US dollar's dominance of the global market on an astronomical level. But not only would it dent the trade, it would also dent confidence in the dollar itself. And a collapse in the dollar, to put it in simple terms, would mean a collapse in the living standards and quality of life of millions of Americans, let alone the impact on its international trade. But for the world order itself would mean a realignment of the global economic and financial order. Now, if I take you back to the beginning of the story from this episode, talking through that big cycle, this is evidence of the American economy being on the decline. And the collapse of all empires share a common thread, and that is the inflationary destruction of their own currencies through government expansion, the printing of money, and perpetual wars abroad. And this is something that America has faced now for many years preceding this, but now exacerbated by this situation. Now, again, to hold a message of hope, whilst history tells a story, it doesn't necessarily predict the future. There are ways and means that the inevitable can be postponed or even change. But on the current trajectory, I would say America is on a worrying course, which of course will have a knock-on the overall global economy. But again, there is hope that it may be stalled, it may take time, but the trend is concerning for the US. Now, the Russian sanctions, although they hold no promise of changing Putin's behavior, and in fact, as I began the beginning of this episode stating the harms that it would cause for the Russian economy, which of course impacts the Russian citizens who, you cannot say are guilty by association. These are human beings who are suffering. Yes, people are dying in the streets in Ukraine, but people will be dying of famine in Russia over the years to come as a result of this economic destruction. But despite this, these sanctions imposed constitute one of the biggest gifts that American policymakers have delivered to China in recent history. Now, by effectively putting Russia, the world's richest country in natural resources, in China's pocket, the sanctions will yield major dividends for a resource-hungry China and potentially bringing down the curtain on the West's long ascendancy. Now, the big question is, what would a new global order at the helm of China look like? Well, many of us may have felt like we've experienced a taste of it over the last couple of years, and that would be fair. But the Chinese leadership has not really offered any explicit description of the world order that it would like to see emerge, the kind of changes it would like to see occur, or if the types of mechanisms, institutions, and norms and rules that it would like to see arise as part of a new international system under its helm. This does not mean, though, that the leadership does not have a vision of what it wants. And whilst official pronouncements provide some clues, additional insights can be gleaned from a careful study of the discussions occurring within the analytical community surrounding the political elites. And whilst I may make statements, as I have just, around what the last 2 years has presented in terms of the authoritarian style centralized approach, which may be akin, or the technocratic approach that may be akin to the China style. Whilst I visited China and spent time in Hong Kong, it would be unfair of me to say I am familiar on a personal level with what the life and conditions under type of rule that is offered in China. It would be unfair of me to state that. But nonetheless, there is clearly some distinct differences between the way that China and the West is governed. And given its statements in other ways about preserving the sovereignty of each nation state, then perhaps we can offer some hope that an international order with China at the helm would enable harmony between the differences amongst the East and West. But it would be seen. So some of the key features of the potential desired order, I think, are already visible in some ways in the current practices that can be seen in terms of its international presentation. Perhaps more pertinently, as I mentioned, what we've witnessed in terms of the rise of authoritarianism across the world, in terms of what the experience of a kind of technocratic relationship in terms of governments may look and feel like. But it does seem that Beijing or China does not seem to be aimed at a complete overthrow of the current international order. At least in the medium term, the objective seems to be building a new partial system carved out of the existing order, with China at the kind of front and center of the economic order, with it being the biggest, most powerful, and most technologically advanced state. It's not imagined that they would seek tight control or full absorption of over other countries into its power, but instead developing deep interdependencies created in the shadow of the current economic, military, and technological dominance of America, making it extremely difficult for other states to then challenge the new system from a position of strength, given the political, economic, and technological might of China. But nonetheless, that might would offer gains for other nations who wish to have a relationship with China. It would serve as an incentive to perpetuate the system and leverage to force compliance with this new international order. Though, as I've said, China may not wish for other countries to replicate its own political system or governance. However, some political commentators in the US have expressed that the Chinese Communist Party leader is seeking a new world order that is far more accepting of authoritarian regime rather than the liberal values of the post-World War II order. Yet it's clear, I think, in that statement that Xi Jinping would prefer the liberal democratic values and principles of the West to be suppressed. It may be that China would encourage others to mirror its domestic practices over wide-ranging areas, from economics to law, education, and media. But talking about big cycles and shifts in economic power, this is merely a projection into what the world could look like. And I certainly don't think those of us in the West who are accustomed to those liberal, free, open values would let go of those things willingly. Although you could argue over the last 2 years that certainly in the face of crisis or now conflict, that people are willing to trade their freedoms for the illusion of safety. So anything is indeed possible. But I think it's a warning sign to the West. But it seems, as I've discussed through today's episode, that China is treading that fine line. It seems to wish to work in harmony for its own benefit, but it does seem to be on the path to global dominance, and the situation in Ukraine and Russia has accelerated that path to dominance as America has begun to fall. So in conclusion, my concluding remarks is that the tension between Russia and Ukraine not only seems to be a long way from resolution, but rather seems to be continuing to mount in more devastating ways. Russia continues to conquer ground in Ukraine while it becomes progressively more isolated from the world through its sanctions and its broken relationships. Those sanctions continue to grow. NATO is becoming stronger and bringing more military to Europe. I even think the war in Ukraine, if it ended today, would not result in the release of broader tensions around the Russian border and between Russia and other nations. It's possible that China will turn Russia into a vassal state that becomes dependent on China in the future. It certainly seems that way economically. But as China is enclosing the West and the East in its web, perhaps all of this is now a prologue for something much larger. Is this the beginning of a new period of geopolitical tension between the US, Russia, and China and the respective allies? Some have already described this as Cold War II. Will this all lead to the beginning of a new world order led by China, or could this result into the expansion of major blocs across the East, North Atlantic, and Europe in the battle for parity or power? Who knows? What we do know is that precious life is being lost. We know that Ukraine is somewhat of a pawn in this global power struggle. And we know that the citizens on either side of the border are the ones that are losing and the ones that are suffering. And as we watch on, this is a reminder for me that many of the issues that we witness in the world, from global conflicts to harmful responses to managing a pandemic, all of these challenges that we witness are usually in the hands and at the helm of a very small number of people in the world who like to play, or seemingly enjoy playing, the game of life as a game of chess where the people are the pawns on the board. Whether that's technocratic powers who wish to wield their authority across nations, whether it's the global elite bypassing government protocol, greasing the wheels of commerce, whether it's the world leaders playing out their wild dreams with us, the citizens, the ones that suffer. Either way, it's a small number of people playing a big old game where the balance of power, the imbalances of power, are essentially at the heart of many of the world's problems. That discrepancy between us, sovereign citizens, and the global powers is becoming increasingly overt. And for those of us who wish to live in a planet that is free from conflict, for those of us who wish to live in a planet that is peaceful, harmonious, those of us who wish to live in free, open societies, we must recognize that the changing world order, whether it comes from a changing economic and political order in the form of China ascending and the US descending, or whether it comes from the form of a global private-public partnership that seeks to create dominance in the West, minimizing government and maximizing corporate interests. However it plays out, we must recognize that it's in our hands really to course correct and change the course of history. The question that I asked tonight is, what are these events doing in terms of the geopolitical order? History shows us many different patterns, as I opened up with. Now, some of the other patterns that history has shown us is that when citizens, when civilians, when individuals like you and I begin to come together and to recognize the challenges that we're facing and to be willing to stand up against those challenges, history has shown us that movements, revolutions, counterculture can emerge at scale, which tips the balance of the order. And I believe, and the reason why I wanted to share this episode tonight in this particular way, at length, at scale, at depth, I've been talking now for an hour, is to give you an understanding of the global power dynamics in order that you and I can reclaim our sovereignty and begin to play our role in shifting the future to a brighter, more positive, more peaceful, more prosperous, vibrant, healthy journey for each of us, a path for each of us to walk. I do believe the future is in our hands. We may not individually be able to end the war in Russia and Ukraine, But we can stand together in global peace. We can stand together in solidarity for peace. We can stand together with a global declaration of peace of our own. We must recognize that many of the ills and the harms of the world are merely a function of the way in which the system is set up and the way in which human beings interact within those systems. The interests of the global powers are not aligned, I believe, with the interests of the people and the planet, and that it's down to us to make sure those interests are realigned. Put in simple terms, the standard of living, in the way it's always been evaluated, has historically been a function of two very simple things: growth in GDP per capita, meaning growth in production per person on a national scale, and health is measured by length of life on aggregate. There's no measure of quality of life. There's no measure of mental, emotional, physical well-being. There's no mention of harmony amongst us. There's no mention of the joie de vivre of our lives. We really need to address what we use to determine what is important in life. And we need to make sure the incentives of human beings are brought into an alignment that serves the interests of all the people, one humanity, all rich in our differences. That is the beauty of life. It's the rich tapestry of what makes us wonderful as human beings, but able to operate in harmony within those differences in united polarity, with the common aim of raising our own standard of living so that we can live wonderful lives and tread lightly on the planet in order that we also preserve the interests of nature. Change has to happen. Change is begging to happen. How many more warnings do we need from global events like this that something is not right, and that now is the time for change? So whilst you may not expect such a somber and dry presentation of the events in China and Russia to end with such a positive stance, if it even could be described as positive. But I do believe now we must become empowered. We must become engaged. We must become active participants in changing the future of this planet, not only for ourselves, but for future generations to come and the world we live in. Because we cannot continue to hop from one crisis to the next, one conflict to the other, in order to be captivated by what we see on our screens, held bondage in fear. We need to find a way to become intrinsically empowered. We need to find a way to alter the values system of this earth. We need to realign the incentives in order that we create a different trajectory for humankind in the face of these existential threats, which are not limited to viruses and international conflicts. It's time for us to change the story. It's time for us to turn the page and author a new chapter for humankind that is not based upon war, upon hate, upon greed, but based upon love, based upon compassion, respect, harmony. It's down to us to cultivate that. And it's in each one of us has the power in order to transform the world around us. I truly believe that. We must become the change we wish to see. We must shepherd in a new world order of our own, a world order that is grounded in peace and love, a world order that is respectful of each other's views, a world order that gives the equal weight to individual rights and freedoms and the shared interests of humanity in the world we live in. All of this is within the realm of possibility. All of it is within the realm of human imagination. The greatest thing that distinguishes human beings from other creatures is the fact that we have ingenuity, creativity, and I truly believe no matter how big, how scalable the problem that we are facing, that we can surmount it. And it's down to us now to take those steps. Now, if I'm talking your language here, and you're still with me after an hour of economics and global politics, there's much more interesting things we could be doing with our time, but it's of our time. We must understand the world we live in order to change it. Then please do join us inside the Elevate Network. The Elevate Network is a free online platform. It's a place where we are seeking to elevate humanity and enrich the world. It's an exploration amongst ourselves about how we can reshape the future in the wake of all that we're facing today in order that we can create a better tomorrow. So I invite you as our guest to come and join us. Join the conversation after this discussion tonight. Add your views, share your perspectives, share your concerns, but ultimately share your hope and inspiration. Share your ideas. It's a place for us to explore how we move forward from here. So join us inside the Elevate Network. You can visit us at weareelevate.org. Tonight, we've asked the question, could the geopolitical situation mark the beginning of a new world order? Seemingly, the indicators are there, but history, again, will show us this is a period of transition that's likely to last years. Nothing is set in stone. But the benefit of knowing patterns of history means that we can actually alter the course of history. We can alter the course of the future. That's the benefit of hindsight. Let's use hindsight now to help us move to a better tomorrow. I'll leave you on that for tonight. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already for more content like this. This is my initial foray into the storyline, the story of the situation in Russia and Ukraine, taking a different angle on this, recognizing the macro environment, taking a zoom out. We've broadcast over 500 episodes on the Pandemic Podcast. We're now changing the branding. We're going to be opening up the conversation, looking at a broader set of world issues and exploring how we can create change in the world. So the Pandemic Podcast will come to its closure at some point. We will continue to cover the stories pertaining to the pandemic. We'll continue our work to tackle the issues in the post-pandemic phase, looking at post-pandemic reform. But we want to expand the story in order to tackle these broader world issues and start to pontificate about how we can change the world in the wake of all these things. So you can subscribe to the podcast at danjgregory.com/pandemic. You'll join our mailing list and you'll hear about all of our future episodes. Thank you so much for engaging. Thank you for all of your comments. Thank you for sharing this important episode. Together, we can change the world. Thank you very much. Peace and love to you all. I'll see you again next week.